In this video, we'll learn about the GDP deflator and how to compute it, and as well as talk about how do we get to computing the inflation rate for the economy. Okay, now recall from the previous video that we had computed nominal and real GDPs for masks and for an economy that was producing masks and sanitizers for these 3 years. Okay, so we have these different values, and what we're going to do is understand what GDP deflator is first and then try to get to how to compute it. So GDP deflator is just one type of price index that we might come across. So it is a price index, and it tells us about what is going on with the overall level of prices. So overall level of prices. And what we already know is that nominal GDP can be higher from one year to the next if prices are going up, okay? Or if quantities are going up, quantities that we produce of masks and sanitizers, or both. So nominal GDP can go up because of these reasons. But real GDP only goes up when quantities that are produced of one good or the other or both go up. Okay, so what we can do from these two types of statistics, nominal and real GDP, we can calculate a price index which reflects what is going on with the price level. Okay, so let's write this in a different color. GDP deflator for any year equals nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. There is no percentage, there is nothing here. Nominal and real GDP both are measured in dollar terms or in whatever other currency that you might be looking at. But those that currency in the numerator and denominator would get canceled out, right? So what you would have ultimately is just a number, and the number by itself doesn't make sense. What we would have to do ultimately is to compare what is going on with GDP deflator over time. Okay, so it is a price index. It's just not going to make sense by itself. We have to compare 1 year to the next. So let's try and use this information to compute GDP deflator for the different years that are given to us. So at this point, this is a good time to pause the video and work through this on your own. The GDP deflator in 2019 equals in 2020 equals, and in 2021 equals, this is what we got to calculate. Okay, so GDP deflator in 2019 is going to be, I'll write this out first and then you can do the rest on your own. GDP deflator in 2019 is going to be the nominal GDP in 2019 divided by the real GDP in 2019 times 100. Okay, and so if you look at those numbers, this is basically saying this is $200 divided by $200 times 100. Okay, and that value is just equal to 100. Okay, so I'll try to erase this part so we can make this a lot neater than this. Okay, and we can write down something simpler. So this is just $200 divided by $200 times 100, which is equal to 100. Okay, now remember that for the base year, since 2019 is our base year, GDP deflator is always going to be taking a value of 100. because nominal and real GDP perfectly cancel each other out. Okay. Similarly, we can do this for the year 2020, where we are going to take the nominal GDP, which is our numerator for 2020, which is 600. So you're going to keep looking at that table up there, divided by the real GDP for 2020, which is 350 times 100. Okay, and you're going to get to 171.42. And for 2021, this is going to be 1200 divided by 500 times 100. And that value is 240. Okay, now let's just focus on what is going on with prices. So if GDP deflator is like a price index and it's telling you about the overall level of prices, then what we know is from 2019 to 2020, prices rose, and from 2020 to 2021, prices also rose. Okay, but we might not want to just look at these numbers. We might actually want to calculate percentage changes. Okay, so what we want to do, or economists are often interested in talking about inflation. And inflation, like you all know, is a term that describes a situation in which the economy's price level or overall price level is rising. We'll get to much more on inflation in later chapters, but right now our goal is to compute the inflation rate. Okay, so the inflation rate is going to be calculated as any percentage. So the inflation rate is the percentage change. First, let's write this down and then we'll compute it. Percentage change in some measure, in some price index, let's put it that way, because it's measuring overall level of prices. It's the percentage change in some price index from one period to the next. Okay, so now that we've calculated GDP deflator for these years, we can calculate inflation rate. And the easiest way to do this, or calculate any type of percentage change, is look at the new value, subtract the old value, divided by the old value times 100%. Okay, so you can use this over and over. Doesn't have to be just in economics, but you can do this over and over. Okay, so let's try and get to, or let's do one thing. We'll rewrite what the GDP deflator was for each year. So we had computed this before. GDP deflator equals, GDP deflator in 2019, in 2020, and in 2021. Okay, so this was 100 because this is the base year, and then 171.42, and finally 240. Remember, there are no units for the GDP deflator. Okay, now the next thing I would like you to do is pause the video and calculate the inflation rate between 2019 and 2020, and calculate the inflation rate between 2020 and 2021. Okay, so here, remember what the formula is. It's new minus old divided by old times 100%. So we'll keep these values. Now this says inflation rate between 2019 and 2020 is going to be the GDP deflator in 2020, which is the new value, right? So I'm going to write in brackets, this is the new value, minus GDP deflator in 2019 divided by the GDP deflator in 2019 times 100%. And this is a percent. Inflation rate is always going to be a percent because it's reflecting a percentage change in the price index, okay? And so we can put some values in here. You don't have to do this if the base is 100, right? So some of you can already see this, but we can write it out anyway. So GDP deflator in 2020 is 171.42 minus 100 divided by 100 times 100%, and this just means prices rose by 71.42%. That's a huge increase in prices. Doesn't happen just like that, okay? But you can also do this for between 2020 and 2021. So we can write down what GDP deflator is for the new year, which is 2021, minus the GDP deflator for 2020 divided by the GDP deflator for 2020 times 100%, okay? Okay, so when you compute these values, this is going to be 240 minus 171.42 divided by 171.42 times 100%, which is equal to 40%, okay? So the inflation rate between 2020 and 2021 was 40%, okay? And this inflation rate is lower than the inflation rate that we had found in the previous years, okay? So while prices are going up, the rate of increase has gone down.